Hello and welcome to the first video. In this video, I'm going to be looking at the basic operation of a 35mm SLR or single lens reflex camera. We're going to look at how the shutter speed and the aperture are used to get the exact amount of light onto the film, the types of film, the film speeds, which we'll go into later, and how to compose your shot. So this is a pretty standard looking retro or vintage camera. You'll see that the light enters through the lens, bounces around what we call a pentaprism, and finally ends up either at the back through the viewfinder onto your eye so you can focus, or at the moment of exposure it actually opens up and exposes directly onto the film. This means whatever you see through the lens is exactly what will be exposed onto the film plane itself. Most of the SLR cameras have detachable lenses. The lens fittings depend on the type of camera. This happens to be a Pentax M42, which is widely accepted on lots of cameras of this sort of era. Here we can see the mirror where the light is bounced up to the pentaprism, and we can see here the ground glass screen that you actually use to focus when you're looking through the viewfinder. On the top of the camera, you'll see a shutter speed selector. This controls how fast the shutter opens and exposes the film. On this camera, the maximum speed is 1/500th of a second, and the slowest is 1 second. There's also a B setting, which means you can control the shutter by holding your finger on the button itself. This is common on many SLRs of this era. This is particularly useful for long exposures like star traces or moving cars. Moving on to the lens, there are two main components that you'll be using when you're taking your shot. The first is obviously the focusing. This is usually at the front of the lens, and the second is the aperture. This is usually at the back, and you'll see it has numbers on it. The aperture controls the size of the hole. This controls the amount of light going through the lens and hitting the film plane. It's a little bit easier to see when we take the aperture component out of the lens itself and show you. It's important to remember that every film has a specific amount of light that should be hitting the film when it's exposed. These are controlled with both the aperture and the shutter speed. We generally use a light meter, either handheld or in this case it has a swinging needle inside the viewfinder to get that exposure absolutely spot on. It can be useful to think about the correct exposure like filling a glass of water. If you open the tap right up, or your aperture right up, it doesn't take long to fill it. If it's closed right down, it will take much longer. So, if you think about it like that, if your aperture is wide open, you can use a faster shutter speed, and vice versa. So let's recap. Every film needs a particular amount of light to hit it before it's correctly exposed. The film's speed is measured in ISO, or more commonly ASA. You need to set your camera to the correct ASA or ISO. The dial is quite often part of the shutter speed selector or on the top of the camera. You control the amount of light that hits the film with the aperture, which is the size of the hole, and the shutter speed, how long that hole is open for. Remember the tap filling the glass of water analogy. You have everything you need now to get started. I would recommend taking several shots of the same subject with different settings, shutter speed settings and aperture settings. In the next video, we're going to look more in depth about the effects of aperture and shutter speed on the final image. Thank you for listening. I hope this is helpful.